Hi, welcome to How Literature Can Save the World, where we explore the written word's impact on our culture and our relationships with ourselves, each other, and the environment. I'm your host, Michelle R. Brady. I am a writer, editor, and attorney who just wants to talk about how we use the power of words for good and where you can find the ones that will help you see the world in a different way, like traveling without leaving your house. So, grab a drink or a blanket or an animal to pet, and let's begin to make our lives more meaningful one book at a time.
The trouble that mankind makes is that he thinks he's Italian, he's German, he's Spanish. We're all humans on this beautiful paradise is our earth.
So, my guest today is different from most of my guests so far because I've selected him based on his work. The work that I've read online that he has written has really moved me. I think he's incredibly talented, and I would like to share his work with the rest of the world in any way that I possibly can. So, my guest today is Brecht de Poortere. He was born in Belgium and grew up in Africa. He currently lives in Paris, France. His writing has appeared or is forthcoming in the Hudson Review, where he got third prize for the short fiction contest, and it's a pretty big deal. It's been in the Missouri Review, the Baltimore Review, Grain, X-Ray, and the Forge Literary Magazine, and Consequence, amongst many others. The other thing that's really interesting about Brecht, that isn't about the quality of his writing, which is amazing, is that he has been so incredibly helpful online with all writers, especially people trying to break into literary magazines. He really has set up sort of a one-man shop to help people figure out when submission windows are open for which magazines, how much they cost, what ranking, it's kind of a weird thing to say that literary magazines can be ranked, but in a way they really can because certain magazines are selected to, have stories pulled from for best American short stories or, pushcart prizes or any of these other awards. And sometimes that's an indication that the quality of the writing in those magazines is, I mean, I don't like to say this, but some people would consider it a higher quality than some other magazines. My view is basically that everyone has a story to tell. I've said it 1,000 times. I genuinely mean it. I don't think that there's good or bad writing. I think there are people trying to express themselves in whatever way they can, and, it really is very subjective. But regardless of that, his the way that Brecht has ranked magazines and helped you figure out how to get to them has been incredibly helpful for me getting into it myself and for, I mean, thousands of other people. So, I think we need to focus on the other things that he does, and his writing is utterly gorgeous and memorable and moving. And so, without further ado, you are going to meet Brecht. Actually, just kidding, a little bit further ado. Brecht's interview was kind of difficult to edit, um, because of some echoing on my end, and so I've tried to minimize that as much as possible to include re-recording this intro, but just, bear with us on this. So I think with that, I would just like to ask about Brecht, what literature, and by that I mean fiction, nonfiction, poetry, essays, anything you remember that you wanna start with, that's helped shaped who you are. I know that's super broad, but
Everything that explains who I am today. Um, I think it's really to start with. I think it's a person that was the trigger, or that changed things in my life. So neither of my parents were readers. I don't think they ever read to me, or at least I have no recollection of it. They have no books in the house. Um, and until the age of 14, I think I read maybe a handful of books that I was forced to read at school. And then at the age of 14, I moved to a French school just for 1 year. And I had this French teacher who completely changed my life in terms of reading and also in terms of writing. What was really nice about him is that he not only did he introduce me to fiction, but to all sorts of other arts that involve words. So we read Zola and Germinal, so that was fiction. But we also read poetry, Verlaine and Baudelaire. We read theater, Antigone by Ennui. We watched movies like Psycho by Hitchcock. We analyzed lyrics of singers. So it was a very broad introduction to arts, and that was the moment I fell in love with arts and literature in particular. And I think that opened a whole new world for me. And also, I think he was the person who introduced me to writing, or at least made me want to be a writer. I remember we had to write stories for our French classes, and then my first few stories were terrible. I would fail miserably. But by the end of the year, I remember writing one story and coming in to the class that day and expecting him to again completely rubbish it. But instead, he read it out for the whole class and said that I had talent to write. And I think that really, at the moment where I felt, maybe one day I'll write. It took me another 30 years to actually start writing, but I think that was a defining moment. And then from that moment on, I just started reading because for a long time I thought you had to read before becoming a writer. And I thought that was the way that you became a writer. So I think, I read voraciously from the age of 14 onwards. And I think my big loves were Balzac, um, Flaubert, a lot of French writers, of course, to start with. But then Steinbeck, D.H. Lawrence, Carsten McCullers, Doris Lessing. Um, yeah, I think those were my big influences of the writers that I really, really loved.
One thing I've noticed is you have a really great command of a vocabulary of language.
No, it's partly true. And I think that's why I'm such a slow writer. It takes me ages to get things right. But it's funny that you say that because again, going back to that experience at the age of 14, when I fell in love with literature, I think that's when I also discovered language. And I remember at that time when I was reading, I would look up every single word that I didn't understand. And then I would write it down. I would have vocabulary, like lists of words that I would just by myself then every morning go through and learn by heart. That's forcing me to do this, but a teenage boy doing this is slightly weird. And maybe you're right about different languages. So my mother tongue is Flemish, and then I had to learn French at some point because I was growing up in Rwanda and my primary school was in Flemish, but then secondary school was in French, so I had to learn French. And then when I was 15, I moved to an English-speaking country, Tanzania, and my school was English-speaking, so I was forced to learn English. And I think it does make you think also about how different languages have different words to express the same thing, but not quite the same thing, you see what I mean? And I think there's actually a website somewhere that collects words from around the world in different languages that mean things, that capture things in one language that don't quite exist in other languages. And I think maybe that's partly also why when I'm writing, I really struggle because I think about things in different languages and try and capture something that I have a feeling about, but I'm trying to find the right word to express it.
So basically, you have an idea that can only be expressed in the language that you're not writing it at that moment. Wow, that's a tough one.
Writers try and do anyway, that we have something we want to express and try and find the right words for. And I think that's the challenge with writing, but also what's so enjoyable about writing when you do get it right, when you do find the right words. At least that's how I look at it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I read this book called How Emotions Are Made. I think it's by her name is Lisa Feldman Barrett. Anyway, and it was essentially about the concept that without a vocabulary, you you don't have those concepts. Like, without a word for something, you don't have the concept of this type of blue or this kind of snow because there's no way for you to articulate it and to share that with other people, and so that concept essentially does not exist for you. Yeah, I think that's really interesting.
You're right. I think I read similar research. It was, I think it was psychologists working with young people and children from poor backgrounds who didn't acquire the vocabulary to to know what they were feeling, so they didn't have the words to express what they were feeling, and so anger and sadness for them was the same thing because they couldn't distinguish it.
Yeah.
And I think that's true generally, and I think that's why reading and writing is so helpful because it just helps you understand yourself better and your emotions. And, even at this point in my life, I'm still trying to understand myself. And I think writing helps me to do that.
So, speaking of that, is there something that you've written that through the process of writing it, you've come to accept or to learn something about yourself? I know for me, when my mom died, I started writing this book, and that process has really gotten me through all the different things that I feel about her, and our relationship. And in a way, that was its own reward. Maybe it's the biggest reward, honestly. I wonder if writing has helped you in the same way.
Yes, I think absolutely. I think all my writing is like that. It's trying to process emotions I have. Um, and by putting them on the page, I understand them better. But also, it's a kind of cathartic experience where I let them out and then I can move on. I realized that a lot of my early writing was all about Paradise Lost. So I grew up in Africa, the place I loved and that I missed intensely. And all my early writing were all about that and how, but it helped me get over it. So I think it was a really important process that I had to go through in order to kind of heal from this horrible nostalgia I felt for a time which was gone, and a place which in a way is gone as well because it's changed so much. But my writing is still like this. I'm working on essays at the moment, which are all about dealing with things that have happened in my life or are happening in my life. And yeah, understanding myself and my emotions better and helping me process them.
Yeah, and I know you recently got to go back, right? And you took your children, if I'm not incorrect.
Yes, I am working. Well, one of the essays I'm working on at the moment. So I think of all the places where I've lived, I think Rwanda was the one that I loved the most, but also that's left the biggest impact on me. And partly that's because, of course, of what has happened in Rwanda with the genocide. And after 30 years, I went back. So we left in 93, a few months before the genocide. And after 32 years, I finally went back. And it's something that I'd wanted to do for a long time. But there were all sorts of reasons I didn't. But I think the main reason was that I was worried to find a place that wasn't the place that I remembered it to be.
Yeah.
And, but at the same time, I always wanted to go back because I always wanted to show my children where I grew up. And I wanted them to see it at about the same age I was when I lived there. Now, I realized that was maybe a mistake because I thought you could pass things on.
Yeah.
But things are not that easy. Things don't work like that. So that's what I'm writing about in this essay.
Before you guys went, did you try to introduce any literature to prep them for what they were about to get into? I know when my daughter and I went to the UK, we read a bunch of books beforehand about, just life in England and why people came to America. A lot about the monarchy. She was very interested in that, as you can imagine. And I just think when it comes to topics that are so much more difficult than kings and queens, like genocide, I wondered if you might have used some of those tools to help you get them prepped.
So I did try and prepare the kids for what country they were going to. So at least they knew, some of the background of the genocide, why it happened, the consequences, what the country is today, the conflicts it's involved in today, so that at least they didn't go just on safari or an ad.
Which I've done.
They saw a bubble and without realizing what the country was really like. So I think they understood that, and I think it helped them understand a little bit better where they were. But I was also saying that, one of the reasons I wanted to go there was to pass on some of my childhood to them and show them the place where I'd grown up and have them have some of the same experiences that I had when I was young. And they did have some of those experiences, but I realized being there, and this seems obvious with hindsight, is that I cannot replicate my childhood or pass it on. There are kids living today in a completely different country, in a different time, and that's just the way things are.
I want to try a theory out on you. I have always sort of believed that travel is one of the most important things you can do to gain empathy and learn about other people. But what you just said about seeing things in a bubble as a tourist and then perhaps having a false belief that you understand a culture or a country from a weekend you spent, I wonder how much more beneficial reading is because you can get the words from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and fully immerse yourself in someone's identity and their life and their culture all at the same time. And it's a lot cheaper. I wonder if you have thoughts on those two as being similar or if you've never thought of it or whatever you think.
I definitely think that the reading is a kind of traveling to, to a different time, a different place, different culture. I think both are important, traveling and reading. And I think it's really important that you do both when you go to a country, because like you said, you can go to Cambodia for a week, have a great time, and know nothing about the country's history. And to some extent, that's fine. But it also depends what you want to get out of it. If you just want to go to a beach, that's fine. Get some sunshine, swim in the sea. But if you want to understand more about the world, then I think, of course, travel, I think is important. That's why I see this. That's what I do with my children also. I try and travel a bit with them so that they see parts of the world, because I think you learn from that.
Yeah.
But I also think that reading is indispensable if you want to understand the world. And like you said, it's often cheaper.
Yeah, it's way cheaper. No, I was just thinking then in the context of geopolitical violence because I've noticed that people who've been in the midst of it on either side as a civilian or a combatant, sometimes will have really strong views about it and they sort of extrapolate into the entire conflict without really knowing more than just what they saw. Um, and not that that's not important, but I think you need to have both, a larger context and the experience on the ground, or that's probably the best combination to understand something.
No, you're right. But I think writing and reading can help. But I think it can also be very dangerous in in propagating, replicating narratives,
Yeah.
and they are one-sided as well. And I think this is, of course, I don't know the solution to this. And then
Right.
I know that, of course, reading will help with getting a wider perspective on things and hearing different viewpoints. But you have to want to get those different perspectives, because otherwise it's too easy to fall back on your preconceptions and your view of the world and look for validation of what you already think.
Yeah, I am taking a class for my advanced law degree, and we're talking about active listening and sort of performative active listening, where it's just this show, but you don't actually seek to understand, and what a difference that makes on your listener. I think that's definitely true.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very hard listening to people. And I realized that only quite late in life what a skill it is, to, and a good skill it is to be able to listen. Um, it's not something that comes obviously to people unless you're taught it and unless you consciously think about it. But it's not just listening, it's also, I mean, the same applies to reading, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Oh, and I do want to ask you because I'm afraid I'm going to forget. Okay, so what I know about you is that you write, you love art, you're a musician. So tell me about economics because it just doesn't seem to go with everything else you've got going on.
No, how did you know about this? It's very secret. Um, it's true that in my day job as an economist, I wanted to be an actor, and um, that didn't work out because my dad didn't want me to become an actor. He said you can become an actor, but first you have to do a proper degree. I did a proper degree. I did the subject that was worse at the school, which was economics. Uh, that's, I think, how I picked it. I think I like the challenge.
Yeah.
But but I also think there was slightly more behind my choice. And it's so I when I think about what interests me in life and going back to literature and reading, I think at a very at the very beginning, I just like art for art's sake. I just like pretty words. But I think over time I became conscious that the writers that I really admired were often very or wrote about social issues. People like Steinbeck, people like Zola. And I think that was then also reflected in my choice of university studies. I think I studied economics because at heart, economics is a social science. It's about understanding human behavior. And I like to believe, about trying to get to a better society. So in my writing, I think I often write about social issues, conflict, things like this. And I think in my work as an economist, I also write, but the purpose is similar, I think, or at least some of the topics that I write about are similar. So it doesn't seem maybe as strange as it seems initially that, yeah, I become an economist. Although, of course, I would rather be a writer full time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good point. You're using two different avenues to affect change in the same problems. Yeah, I totally get that. I feel like that's what I'm trying to do with the law as well. And it sometimes is disappointing how difficult it is, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I can think of some successes,
Yeah.
and um, they're small successes, but I think they made all of it worth it. Things I wrote at work that made a difference to people's lives. Um, I think that gives a feeling of satisfaction that you've achieved something.
Yeah.
If you've written something that made people think differently. And that applies to my creative writing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, you said something earlier about the kinds of work you like to read, and not just the social issues, but something about the way people were trained. I can't remember, but it just made me think about education for writers generally. You know, do you think you need education as a writer to write? Or is it living a life worth writing about? Or does it need to be some sort of combination?
So I think if you have those experiences, I think that's a big advantage. And I do think that a lot of stuff that gets published today is often based off from writers who had experienced certain things. But I also think that some people are just such good writers that they can write about anything. And I'm thinking about people like Flaubert, for example, who I don't think did much else but write with his life. And but also people like Zola, who were very journalistic in their approach to writing. But of course, we're talking about geniuses here, and I don't, I think most of us are not. And I think it does reflect in people's writing when they have experienced certain things. It does enrich their writing. I think most people would find it very difficult to imagine what it's like to, for example, have lived in a country where there was conflict or that's at war. And Of course, I think really good writers can do that, can imagine it, but even they won't be able to do it without a substantial amount of research. And I guess living it is the most immediate kind of research that you can do.
Yeah, and it sort of feels like your job to share those experiences with people who will never have them and never get to understand the perspective that comes from living certain experiences. And I sort of feel like if you do, maybe those issues won't continue as often, because people will understand what it feels like to be there. But, maybe that's idealistic.
I'd like to believe it, but look at what's happening in the world. It's just history repeats itself over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. All right. I know what you're working on, essays. Are you going to make this a book?
No, because I think that's too much work. I go for instant gratification. We should aim for publications in journals. We Not that that's instant gratification, having to like keep before you hear back from a journal, but I I think I would struggle. My understanding of collections is that you need at least a few unpublished pieces, and I'm not sure I'm willing to wait for that. So no, I don't think I'll work towards a collection, but yeah, I'm working on 4 essays at the moment. That's something I haven't done it before. All my writing before was fiction.
Yeah.
So this is a very different ball game, but and I'm finding it very challenging, but also I'm learning a lot.
Well, my problem is I always wanted to write essays too, but I like the separation of feeling like although all of the things could be true, it's still fiction, you know?
It's true that to some extent all the fiction that I write is also in a way
Yes.
autobiographical in some way, but you're right, there's more freedom and you can make stuff up to some extent. And that's the problem with essays is that you can't make it up. You have to base it on real life. I'm finding it very, very challenging.
Well, I'm excited. Oh, I wanted to know about something you believed. I don't know, however long ago you want to go, but something that you don't believe anymore and why you changed your mind.
I think there are so many things I used to believe and that I don't believe anymore, um, which is in a way quite sad. I think I've become very cynical. One thing that struck me recently is that I think I used to believe that life was linear, that you would get from A to B and constantly progress and improve if you worked hard enough at something. And I've learned the hard way that life is not like that. And I guess the same applies to writing. Is that
Yeah.
I used to think that again the writing process was a linear process and you go from success to success, but I don't think that's the case. And you'll face setbacks. And I know this sounds really naive, that
No, it
I'm
doesn't.
discovering this at this point in life, but and maybe I've been lucky that so far life has been to some extent linear, and I guess maybe my writing as well to some extent has been linear so far, but it's not. That's not the way things happen. And I often like to think of all these things like it's like playing a game, like playing Monopoly. Is that you lose sometimes and bad things happen to you.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And that's just part of it. And I think it's the same with the writing process. Bad things happen and you just move on from there. It's all a learning experience.
Yeah. No, I don't think that's naive at all. In fact, I think it would be difficult to progress if you didn't believe that your hard work would be, rewarded at some point.
And I think for me, I get rejection from some opportunity, like a fellowship, a residency, submission, agents, contests. I mean, I get rejections daily. I just expect them. And so when something isn't one, it's like a fun surprise.
It's true.
They're like, "Oh, thank you."
Be- I think I have a similar attitude and people always call me a pessimist or just said I'm a realist. I expect rejection. And then when I don't get rejection, it's brilliant.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But you are building a platform, so no matter what you do, you're building toward a bio that when you're ready for your book because I think you are just refusing. But when you're ready, then I think you'll have everything you need. Okay. Is there anything I haven't asked you?
There were a few questions that you'd send me, tips for writers.
Oh, yeah. Tips. Go.
So that's a difficult one because I thought about this a bit, and I think writing is so subjective, and the writing process is so subjective, and what works for some people doesn't work for others. But I know what worked for me, and maybe that will work for some writers. So I think for me, routine is really important. Writing every day. I write every morning, every evening if I can. I do that because it's like going to the gym and strengthening your muscles. If you don't go to the gym for a long time, you lose those muscles. And I think the same applies to writing. I also think that creativity is something that you can force. I think if you sit at your desk for long enough, something nice is going to come out. And the other thing, and this goes back to something we were saying earlier about things I used to believe. Um, I, or I used to edit as I was writing all the time. And one thing that I've learned is that there's people who tell you that you just need to get the kind of the broad outline down on the page first. I think they're right. I think so much of writing is producing material that you will never use. So what's the point of spending ages editing a paragraph or a sentence that you're never going to use? So those are some of the things that I've learned. Maybe some writers find that helpful too.
Yeah.
I think the only strong piece of advice that I would give writers is about if you want to get your work published, it's to never ever self-reject. I think that's the biggest mistake you can make as a writer. It's not up to you to decide what a journal or a publisher will put out there. It's up to them to decide. And so the worst thing you can do is not try. Let others decide the value of your work. I think I don't think you as a writer are a good judge of your own work.
No, I think that's exactly right.
You never know, right?
Yeah, maybe it's a slow year for them. And I'm the best one.
You know what's interesting? I once was a reader for a journal, and that was a really, really interesting experience because I realized that when the story, so whether or not I like the story might sometimes depend on when in the day I am reading it, or what my day is like, or, and luckily that journal had many readers looking at the story. So in the end, I know that the good stories were always the ones that were selected for publication. But it doesn't always work like this. And your story that you send to a journal, your poem, might be a brilliant story or poem, and they might reject it just because they were not in the right mood that day. And vice versa, that it might happen that they're in a brilliant mood, and for some reason they love your story that day. So I just think don't judge your own work, don't reject your own work, let others do that. And there has to be an element of luck involved in all this. There are millions of stories being written all the time. And well, the odds are slim in publication, we know that. And sometimes luck has got to be on your side. So in the end, it's a numbers game. And the more submissions you send out there, the greater your chances of getting published.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I read a study about judges. The sentencings they did when they were hungry or tired were way harsher than when they weren't.
And they just used how they felt physically as a heuristic for that case and its merits, instead of recognizing that they were separate things.
And I believe it. It's human nature.
Yeah.
I think it's the same when you apply for jobs. I remember, or for you, like I remember, when I applied to university. I like to blame it on this. I'm sure there's other reasons why I didn't get into that university, but I was the last person being interviewed after 3 days of interviews. I could tell that the people interviewing me were tired. It's just human nature. And I think the same applies with stories that you send to magazines for publication. It's some of it at least is down to luck. So yeah, keep trying your luck, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also say if you submit the same story to multiple publications, simultaneous submissions, which is what I do, it's very interesting to see. So you'll get a tiered rejection from one place and another place will reject it outright. But I think that that's helpful in seeing that some of these things are kind of arbitrary and it's just someone's opinions.
I've even seen stories of people who've sent the same piece to a magazine twice and once were rejected and the second time accepted. Maybe they fell on different readers. Maybe they found the same person who didn't remember it. They read the piece another day. Yeah, it surely is a numbers game. If we think about acceptance rates and yes, many of these journals, they're 1% or way below 1%. So I always say you have to get at least 100 rejections before you've really tried to get a piece out there.
Right, especially with magazines that solicit work. Okay, so I want to leave everybody with a book recommendation from you, although you've made quite a few at this point. So if you feel disinclined, it's fine.
No, so this is one of the questions that you sent me that I actually thought about a little bit, and I'm trying to think of recommendations that are maybe of books that maybe people are unlikely to have read. So one book that I absolutely loved, and which I think is the greatest movie that hasn't been made yet, is Salammbô by Flaubert, which is an absolutely fantastic piece of work. So rich, so over the top, but beautifully written. Then another writer that maybe people that I know influenced me a lot, and maybe I hesitate to recommend him because I haven't read him in years, and I don't know whether I would still like him if I read him now. But I know that Andre Brink, the South African writer, Andre Brink, was an author that really had a big impact on me when I was in my 20s. Um, then there's a book I read recently, which maybe in the English-speaking world people might not have heard of,
Mhm.
but which I thought was absolutely brilliant. It's by a French author called Alice Zeniter, and the book is called The Art of Losing, and it follows 3 generations of Algerians who have fled the war in Algeria and moved to France. So that was the first generation. And then the generation that grew up in France and how they relate to the past, how they relate to Algeria, what their identity is. I thought it was a brilliant book.
This is so awesome. I've had a great time. You make me seem incredibly inarticulate, which is fine.
And just thank you again, Brecht, for such a great conversation. And just for everyone listening, I want to flag that on November 21st, which is 2 Fridays from now, the guest will be Adrian Bodenberger, who's a journalist, former elected official, combat veteran, and author. And it's a pretty great conversation. So I hope you tune in for that one as well.
Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, and in the words of my daughter,
Let's hip hop our way out.